Well, hello and welcome to this webinar on case studies and ethics from the SHERPA project. My name is Kevin Macnish. I'm an assistant professor in ethics and technology at the University of Twente, and I will be talking you through a lecture presenting the findings that we had of these case studies for the SHERPA project over the next 20 minutes. As you can see, there's an opportunity to ask questions. If you type those, then they will come up. I will see them in the first instance, and then when I finish the talk, I will read through the questions and answer them then. So don't wait till the end to ask questions. Do feel free just to type your questions at any point while I'm talking, or indeed afterwards, and then we will deal with them then. As I say, the talk is scheduled to last around 20 minutes. We have a full hour scheduled for the webinar, so we have plenty of time for questions and discussion at the end. So where we're going with this talk, firstly, why look at case studies? What's important about case studies? Which case studies did we consider? How we ran the case studies, and then the analysis and findings, what we drew from these case studies. Finally, the conclusions that we drew from the case studies as to where we should go as a result of the findings that we had. So that's what I'm going to be covering in the next 18 minutes or so. So why case studies? Well, in the first place, the existing research on ethics dealing with big data and artificial intelligence tends to be very conceptual and focused on one or two key illustrations, which a lot of people are now familiar with. So for instance, there's a case from about 2011 of looking for potholes in Boston using the accelerometers in people's smartphones. It was a great idea. However, it overlooked the fact that back in 2011, certain groups of society, particularly poorer groups, didn't have smartphones and therefore didn't have accelerometers. And this meant that people who used an app to spot these potholes would typically be the wealthy middle classes and not the poorer people. And so inadvertently, any app that was used to identify potholes would be biased. Similar problems came up more recently in, I think, 2016 or 17 with so-called racist soap dispensers that were designed to dispense soap automatically when a hand was put underneath them, but the dispensers were only ever tested on people with white skin. And so when the dispenser was exposed to somebody with black skin, then no soap came out. And this didn't really seem to arise as an issue until the soap dispensers were shipped to a company in Nigeria and seemed not to work. And in fact, they didn't work. So cases like these are very well known and talked about in the literature, but more mundane day-to-day instances of how people are dealing with big data, artificial intelligence, and the ethical issues that arise therefrom are just not well discussed in the literature. And so this is why it was important to go out for the SHERPA project and develop these case studies. So we wanted to look at a variety of things, such as who faces which issues, what were the key issues that policymakers need to focus on, rather than the key issues that philosophers or social scientists think are the most important. Furthermore, the ones that we're talking about, such as the Boston pothole example in academic literature, may well indeed have already been resolved. And there may be other issues out there of which we're simply not aware because we keep talking about the same cases. So this is why it was important to go out and look at case studies and look at new issues that were being raised. So which case studies did we look at? After a brainstorming session as to the key areas of industry that may be using artificial intelligence and big data and the way in which they would be using them, we narrowed down to 10 groups where I'll summarize. Instead of saying artificial intelligence and big data, the SHERPA term that we've been using is smart intelligence systems. So I'll talk about smart intelligence systems from now on. Where these are being used was in employee monitoring and administration, in government, agriculture, sustainable development, and you can see the list from the slide rather than have me reading through it. Now, within each of these, of course, there are a variety of companies and local governments, national governments we could have spoken to. How we actually decided on who to investigate and who to interview for the case studies That was determined as much as anything by people who were in contact with us, people who we already knew, people who were available, people who were willing to talk to us about their systems and the ethical issues arising from their systems, their technical expertise, and the potential that the company and the use had for deriving interesting findings. Now, it's worth pointing out at this stage that the findings, of course, because of this, are indicative. There's no way we could be conclusive with this approach. And I think it'd be very difficult for a case study approach to find conclusive results as a result of this. So how do we actually run them? Well, we started out the SHERPA project back in May of 2017 now, no, 2018, I'm sorry. And one of the first things that we recognized we needed to do was to develop a case study protocol. This would agree on how the case studies were to function in order that the case studies had a consistency across them, that we would have results that we could compare and contrast. That took probably around 2 months to develop and included weekly Skype meetings. And in fact, throughout the lifetime of these case studies, those of us involved in the case studies met at least once a week over Skype. The case study protocol then set out how we would go about doing the case studies. This began with conducting general background research and contacting the organizations with whom we had contacts to agree schedules and get consent for holding interviews. Once we had that agreement, we could then go into more depth on the particular companies. And around about September of 2018, we went out and conducted most of the interviews and then had them transcribed. In October of 2018, we then analyzed the interviews, putting the transcriptions up into the in vivo software, and we then wrote them up in November and December. And then finally, earlier this year, in around about February, March time, we began to analyze the case studies across the board, looking at what were the similarities and what were the differences across the case studies. And that's really what I'm going to be presenting next. So the findings that we had, I think we came out with a list of around 27 ethical issues that were being dealt with by people engaged in smart information systems. And of course, 27 just becomes far too unwieldy. So we narrowed those down, or rather we grouped them into 5 key clusters that you can see here. So the first cluster, control of data, looked at issues around privacy, security, informed consent, probably the area most spoken about in smart information systems ethics at the moment. Secondly, we had the reliability of data, the concerns that if the data isn't reliable, then the results are not going to be reliable, and problems could arise out of that, particularly some of those sort of bias issues I was referring to at the beginning. Justice issues then came up, the fact that there are power asymmetries. Some people, some companies may have a lot of information and others may have relatively little. And the benefits which come from having that information could be tremendous and could entrench power further, leading to justice issues. Economic issues, again, talked about, particularly in terms of employment. What is the future of employment with smart information systems? Are we going to see large degrees of unemployment resulting from their institution? And then finally, key human freedoms, key human rights, issues such as autonomy, freedom, human rights in general. Now, of course, each of these are not unique. There are overlapping elements within each of them. Privacy, for instance, is widely recognized as a human right, as is the right to employment. So these aren't intended to be unique, exclusive areas. They are, as I say, broad clusterings of ethical issues. But if we go into each of these in a little more depth, then the control of data issue was one that the respondents we spoke to in the case studies were probably most aware of as a potential concern. For those who had always been concerned with privacy, the introduction of GDPR was a tremendous benefit for them, because it meant that they could now say to their colleagues, look, I know I've been talking about privacy for years, but now the European Parliament insists that we take privacy seriously. And so the GDPR, if you remember, had been introduced in May, or came into effect in May 2018. And by having the interviews in September, GDPR was still a very fresh and live issue for a lot of people. By the same token, the introduction of GDPR meant that privacy as an ethical issue wasn't seen as being a particularly major concern for many of the people with whom we were speaking. Either it had already been dealt with because the new law meant that they already had sought consent from people with whom they were interacting, or they simply weren't dealing with the sort of personal data that GDPR copes with. It's worth saying that, again, in line with GDPR, that consent of people was generally seen to waive at least some privacy rights. Clearly, if I give consent to using a loyalty card, that doesn't mean I therefore have no privacy rights in front of that company. But the information which I do agree to give them, I can't then claim subsequently is private information. And it's worth saying as well, there were some problems which came up with transparency of data, both inside organizations and outside. As data is collected, we want to hold companies accountable. And in order to do that, we want to have access to the data to see what they are doing with it. And I say companies, that would be true of governments as well. But of course, the problem there is if we could see what governments and companies were doing with data, then we would also have access to some degree of other people's data. And so there become conflicts there between transparency and privacy concerns. So that was the control of data section. And I'll just pause here and say, do feel free, if you have any questions, do raise these questions, do type them in at any point while I'm talking, and then I will come back to them when I finish. So that was the control of data cluster of issues. The second cluster was reliability of data. And again, as I suggested in the overview, this really stems from a variety of issues. It could be poorly written algorithms, poor training data used to train those algorithms as to what is normal, or the poor use of those data. So in the case of the so-called racist soap dispensers, that would be a matter of poor training data. The soap dispensers were only ever trained on people who had white skin. And so when people who had black skin tried them, they didn't work. And so that was a concern there. The results, as was the case in the soap dispensers, would be that that could lead to bias and discrimination. But this, again, as an ethical issue, was broadly recognized already as a problem, both from people who worked in the policy side of the companies and the governments that we spoke to with the case studies, because they didn't want to see bias, but also on the technical side, because as we say on the slide here, biased data benefits no one. From a technical perspective, if you have biased data, that's going to lead to technically bad results. And so people are already aware of bias and already concerned about bias and looking into it, at least within the companies that we spoke to. And again, I come back to the fact these are just indicative rather than conclusive findings. So the third clustering was that of justice, and really here looking at the equitable treatment of people. Of course, I've already spoken quite a bit about bias now and potential discrimination. But the other key issue here was the fact that SIS are typically owned and operated by powerful groups, whether that's powerful companies or powerful governments. Taking, for instance, the case study we carried out in agriculture, there are large agro-businesses, multinational companies that are able to invest in the technology and draw in data from small companies, from small farms, aggregate that data, and then draw results from it. Now, in theory, those small farms could get together, form a cooperative, but that takes a lot of courage, a lot of time, a lot of effort, which many of them don't have. So as a result, the large multinationals tend to get bigger and stronger and can do more with the data that they collect. By the same token, they also then claim to own the data that they collect and then have a fair degree of control over those farms that have given them the data. And that just entrenches their power still further and can lead to monopolies, which indeed is one of the key problems with economic issues. You'll see, I think, third point down, there is a risk of monopolization of the markets by these large companies because they were first in, They've been able to gather most of the data, and that just gives them the advantages that smaller companies won't necessarily have. Other economic issues that come up would be, for instance, the fact that economic improvements should come from having smart, intelligent systems. And of course, companies won't necessarily, or probably won't, invest in having smart information systems unless they can see economic improvements. And as economic improvements benefit the economy broadly, so they should benefit the whole of society. For public bodies, such as local governments, of course, there's the economic benefits are less important. They still want to make efficiencies, they want to have savings, but the focus for a lot of the local governments that we spoke to was seeking value for citizens. That was far more important than economic benefits. And coming back, I spoke earlier about the risks to employment and the dangers of unemployment. The majority of people that we spoke to generally felt that this was a long way off, certainly not in the next 5 years or so, maybe 10 years plus, that we would start to see unemployment occurring as a result of the implementation of smart information systems. I think where the changes have already occurred within factories, with robots and so on, that's largely already happened. The smart information systems, the use of AI and big data is some way off before that leads to the large-scale unemployment that the robotization of factories has led to in the past. The role of organizations, kind of in this case, we were looking at how organizations interact with people. Key issues here about trust and responsibility. Do we trust organizations with data? Generally speaking, no. And that would be true with both organizations and governments, but that's recognized. The companies recognize that there is a trust issue here. And if they want to continue to collect people's data, then that trust needs to be established. As I suggested earlier, there's already the concern about how we establish that trust when transparency can only be provided to a certain degree, both because of the privacy issues, but also because of intellectual property issues. Companies don't want to share exactly what happens with the data that they collect because that's their intellectual property. That's what gives them a competitive edge. By the same token, disempowerment, as we say here, increases distrust. There's also a problem of what I've called many hands. This is a philosophical term referring to challenges that we have in recognizing where responsibility lies when you have a large number of contributors to a situation. It doesn't necessarily have to be a problem, and we don't have to be talking about blame. It could be talking about who is responsible for resolving issues, who is responsible for particular aspects of an issue. When we have a lot of companies, you might have one company collecting the data, another company storing the data, a third company collating and aggregating the data, a fourth company analyzing it, and then a fifth company actually using the data. And that's a relatively simple breakdown. Of course, you can have far more involved in it than even that. And when that's the case, when something goes wrong, you have to question, well, who is responsible when something breaks down? Finally, human freedoms. One of the big concerns here with human freedoms kind of is related to the privacy issue that I've already spoken about. And that's the concern with surveillance that comes from smart information systems collecting data on people. Clearly, this infringes on privacy, and through privacy, it can infringe on our autonomy and our freedom to act. It can impinge on our self-determination. And through a fear of being watched, a fear of being seen or monitored, that can chill how we act in public. It's been a long established fact that when we are being watched, we will act in particular ways that are different from if we think we're not being watched. And these are known as chilling effects, and they can have an impact in how we behave in society. The most notable threats here are discussed in the media already. I think the Cambridge Analytica concern is a major one. It didn't seem to be a concern in most of the organizations that we looked at in the case studies, but nonetheless recognized and talked about through them. So that's it. That would broadly be the key findings that we had. Where do we go with this, though? What would be our conclusions, our recommendations for the future? Well, I think some of the main insights that we developed were that the developer community, the people that we were speaking to for the case studies, was broadly aware of most of the ethical issues that we had come across in the literature and that we were raising. Very few of the issues were relevant to all of the cases. Some that were, such as privacy, but they were already recognized, as I say, because of GDPR. Some other factors were recognized, but were seen as being outside of the control of actors. Intellectual property being a key one here. Of course, intellectual property is very well established within the law, and companies recognize the importance of intellectual property. And so, but the technical experts with whom we were speaking just said, well, we can't do anything about this. These are the laws, the regulations within our organizations with which we're dealing. Discrimination isn't always easy to recognize. It's often only recognized after the event, such as the soap dispensers. Of course, we can get around that by engaging stakeholder communities more, and I'll talk about that next, as to when we're testing new smart information systems, make sure you have a broad range of the population involved in those tests. But that's often not so straightforward to discover. Likewise, as I'd referenced about the many hands problem, the attribution of responsibility was not always clear as to who would be responsible and what problems. And this is something which has already been discussed quite widely, for example, in the self-driving vehicle debate in the media, of if there is an accident, who is to blame for that accident. And another thing which came out finally here was that there's a need for a broader debate in society. For the people that we spoke to, they were either involved, as I suggested earlier, in policy within these organizations, or within the technical side of things. And their argument was, for a large part, look, we need to have this debate in society. What is the role of smart information systems in society? What does society want from these? Because we know where we're going at the moment, but whether that's a good thing or not is a debate for society at large. So conclusions then, or recommendations at least, these kind of fell into two categories, broadly speaking. One was what can companies, what can organizations do? And then the other was what can society, what can citizens be doing? So within the organization, organizational approaches such as increasing stakeholder engagement, making sure that your testing community is indicative of society, has a broad range of people involved in it. So you can get that through stakeholder engagement. You can also institute codes of ethics within your organization, which will help people to understand what is expected of them. There are technical approaches, privacy preserving mechanisms, for example. K-anonymity is a popular one. But interestingly, we found that the technical approaches to preserving things like privacy tended to be preferred more by people involved in the policy side of things and less by people involved in the technical side of things. And the suggestion that came out of that was that those involved in the technical side of the house tended to recognize where the shortcomings of technical solutions lay. And so there's a wariness, I think, about technical approaches. Human oversight is also a key issue, particularly at this stage in the development of the technology. The technology simply is not sufficiently advanced to run autonomously. And when it does, it's generally not trusted by people. And so human oversight remains an important consideration. And then within the company, again, ethics training is key. The weight of transformation in ensuring that ethics is developed within companies, within smart information systems, typically falls on the technical experts. And yet the irony here is that, of course, the technical experts are typically not trained in ethics. And this is a broad problem across Europe. Working or having worked in several European universities, teaching ethics to technical experts, I know how few of them receive training at an undergraduate or even at a postgraduate level. Still less in terms of continual professional development. And so that is an area which could well be dealt with. Moving on to the public, there is a need to train the public to engage with and to understand smart information systems better. to improve accountability with these organizations, but also to move away from the hyperbole of media reports that tend to over-sensationalize what can be done with smart information systems in order to have realistic debates where people actually speak with one another. Secondly, and again, GDPR has gone some way to dealing with this in Europe and with companies that operate in Europe, is this issue about control of data. I'm hesitant to talk about data ownership, but certainly who has control of data? Should we give the control of that data to the sources of the data, the people who create those data, or to the companies that collect those data? And then what should be done with those data? Finally, public-private partnerships. Regulation of private bodies coupled with public-spirited goals, the recognition that we are bringing about changes in society with the introduction of smart information systems. This has, of course, been called the fourth revolution, and it will see significant changes, or can see significant change. Need to be having these debates, not in the hyperbolic, over-sensationalized approach, such as happened with genetically modified organisms some years ago, but rather a serious, educated understanding whereby we know what is happening, we can appreciate what is happening with smart information systems, and we can make sober, mature judgments as to where we should go with them.